Lebanon, 1920, 2020. Obituary or Resurrection. I'll begin with a quote from Charles Corm's poem La Montagne Inspirée, the first chapter of the poem. My translation from the original French. Quote, "The heart spoke, a famed, maimed old man has come to make whole again my mutilated nation. The arm spoke, with his one remaining arm, he brings back to my embrace cities severed from my nation. The brain spoke, Beirut shall once more be the capital of my thought, the harbor of my nation." End quote. Those words were pronounced, written by Charles Corm on September 1st, 1920. They were gripping, life-giving words issuing from mangled anthropomorphic body parts as opening salvos, if you will, of an epic poem of national salvation. Again, written 100 years ago by Charles Corm, the hallowed mountain, La Montagne Inspirée, the title of his epic poem, had been a celebration of the day Greater Lebanon, the precursor of the modern crumbling Lebanese Republic, was born, or in Corm's words, was brought back to life. Swelling with symbolism and vernal enthusiasm and sprightly national energy, Corm could not have chosen more apt imageries and historical references and symbolism with which to introduce his national revival celebration. An ode, as La Montagne Inspirée was, an ode to a resurrected Lebanon, was prefaced with an encomium to France, the mother of all just liberties, as Charles Corm described France. France incarnated in the person of General Henri Gouraud, the High Commissioner of the French Republic, who would make the declaration of the establishment of Greater Lebanon, a famed, maimed old man who had essentially come to make whole again a mutilated nation. So that quote that I began with was essentially a description of Henri Gouraud. Entrusted in 1920 with League of Nations mandate, charged with building new states on the debris of a defunct, defeated Ottoman Empire, Henri Gouraud was a decorated war hero and a graduate of France's venerable Collège Stanislas in Paris, and he was also a graduate of the Saint-Cyr Military Academy. He was an amputee who had left much of the right side of his body on the battlegrounds of Gallipoli. Gouraud had been a first choice for High Commissioner that the Lebanese delegation at the 1919 Paris Peace Conference had been pushing for. The delegation was headed by then Maronite Patriarch Elias Peter Hoyek. Hoyek absolutely wanted Henri Gouraud to be the first High Commissioner of the League of Nations mandate. And so Gouraud's Republic of Greater Lebanon Proclamation Act of September 1st, 1920 might have been more so a Lebanese Maronite exercise than a French colonial project, contrary to received wisdom, if you will. France was, after all, initially in favor of smaller ethnic states mimicking the former Ottoman administrative divisions, the Vilayet of Beirut, the Vilayet of Damascus, the Vilayet of Aleppo, the Alawite Mountain, and the Druze Mountain. And among those, a smaller state of Lebanon would emerge, mimicking the earlier Mutasarrifiyya of the 1860s. That was the projection of France. Those were the early maps that the League of Nations was dealing with. But the Maronites, a minor people by all accounts, would all but essentially force the hand of a superpower, force the hand of France, impressing upon uh, the Maronites' French allies and friends to put in place a Grand Liban, a Greater Lebanon, a new entity that the Maronites themselves referred to at the Paris Peace Conference as historic Lebanon. And this is a quote from the memorandum that Patriarch Hwayek had submitted. Historic Lebanon, reflecting in its natural historic frontiers the ancient Phoenician homeland, end quote. Thus, it was with the preceding in mind that Gouraud would solemnly consent to the Maronites' desires, the Maronites' appeals. Addressing the Greater Lebanese, the Grand Libanais, then present in Beirut on that auspicious September 1st morning, Gouraud began his proclamation with a reminder to his audience that, quote, the happy, lustrous day is upon us, which the ancestors of the Greater Lebanese of today had for so long and often in vain yearned for, end quote. And so he would declare in affective veneration the rebirth of, quote, a single ancient nation rooted in its past, eminent in its future, impavid, like its subtle, skillful, eloquent Phoenician children rising at the foot of a majestic mountain bathed in the holy waters of a mythical Mediterranean that had once been witness to the fleets of Phoenicia, Greece, and Rome, end quote. Now think of the symbolism here for a little bit. A reborn Lebanese nation declared by a French quote-unquote colonial officer, mimicking the historic references and the symbolisms of the Lebanese themselves, the Maronites who headed the delegation of the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. And so in a sense, a reborn Lebanese nation was a debt of gratitude, if you will, a French debt of gratitude, and a confirmation of a great and old friendship, as Gouraud stressed in his declaration text. A token, and these are his words, a token of France's recognition of the Lebanese people's aspirations, struggles, and triumphs, and a French salute to Lebanon's grandeur and might, end quote. Those were the words of a colonial officer, okay? Try imagining France speaking in such terms about Cameroon or Algeria or its other colonial possessions. Now, historians with too many ideological axes to grind and too few historical nuances to heed still could read Gouraud's and France's gesture as a haughty, nefarious colonial exercise. Yet France, the colonial power, as I mentioned earlier, never had such words with which to describe other colonial chattel. And yet this France, the colonial power, left Lebanon 23 years after its supposed act of colonial fiat in 1943 without firing a single shot, without imposing a single vestige of colonial conceit. And so on this eve of the centennial anniversary of September 1st, 1920, Lebanon teeters on the brink of dissolution. On Tuesday, August 4th, a massive explosion, at least 30 times by some accounts, at least 30 times the size of the US military's Moab, the mother of all bombs, equivalent to the Hiroshima, the explosion itself, not the nuclear fallout. So this massive explosion rocked the Lebanese capital on August 4th at the Beirut Port Authority. The jolts of the blast were felt as far afield as Cyprus and Jordan. Its physical toll, counting to date close to 200 dead, 6,000 injured and maimed, a major metropolis, the jewel of the Mediterranean, demolished, and over 300,000 Beirutis homeless. in urban neighborhoods that have sustained upwards of $15 billion in property damage. Bruised, grief-stricken, disoriented, demoralized, hundreds of thousands of Lebanese took to the streets minutes after the blast, embarking on the painful task of collecting the dead's mutilated remains, digging up maimed survivors from underneath collapsed structures, tending to the wounded, cleaning up mounds of mangled iron and glass and concrete, and mending remnants of shattered lives. But in the same breath, and from behind the tears of sorrow and cries of anger, the Lebanese were also demanding accountability. Years of corruption, political cronyism, and governmental servitude to the international narco-terrorist group Hezbollah, a mercenary detachment of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard. Years of this sort of cronyism and servitude to this group had left Lebanon rudderless, in tatters, a servile colonial chattel ruled and fleeced by Iranian proxies in classic colonial fashion. But the Lebanese are now demanding an international investigation to uncover the causes of a blast that they are convinced had its origins in a highly explosive Hezbollah arms stockpile secretly stored in the heart of Lebanon's largest, most populous metropolis. But the Beirut Port Authority, like all of Lebanon's ports of entry and border crossings, are controlled by Hezbollah, as are Lebanon's ruling elites in voluntary servitude to the Hezbollah criminal racket. And so the calls for an international investigation were rejected out of hand by the Lebanese government. At its head, the President of the Republic, Michel Aoun, an aging, bumbling Hezbollah epigon who in reality is in no position to expose his Iranian paymasters to international scrutiny. And so what I call a brioche moment is in the works for Lebanon. And the brioche moment is a reference to Marie Antoinette and what Marie Antoinette might or might not have said in the run-up to the French Revolution when she supposedly this is a story that comes from only one source, and that is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He's the one who tells the story of advisors to Marie Antoinette, who was inquiring about what's wrong with all of the commotion outside of her palace walls. And they told her, "Your Highness, the people are angry." "Why are they angry?" she said. They said, "Because they're hungry. They have no bread to eat." And supposedly, according to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, giving proof of her complete apathy and detachment from reality, she said, "Well, they don't have bread, let them eat brioche." This is unconfirmed. I don't really have much trust in Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but that's the moment. And the moment here that's what I call the brioche moment, and it symbolizes the apathy of a ruling criminal mafia, the disdain that the Lebanese politicians have given to the sorrows of the people, and this sort of disdain and apathy to the sufferings of the people elsewhere in history led to guillotines and gallows. And in Lebanon's case, guillotines and gallows may indeed still follow. The majority of Lebanese who do not subscribe to the Hezbollah edicts of modern Lebanese history are at their wits' ends. They're at the end of the rope. They're bruised and broken, but they're not defeated yet. And in that spirit of still, remaining hope, they received French President Emmanuel Macron, who visited in a show of support 2 days following the blast, and a show of support that even Lebanon's own ruling classes did not show. And he was received with jubilation and cries of relief. Some Lebanese have, some of the cries included, finally, thankfully, finally, Lebanon has a president now, because Lebanon has a president, but the president is not present. So 2 days after Armageddon, the French president was acclaimed in Lebanon. An acclaim that came out of a very sorrowful place in the Lebanese psyche, but an acclaim also that was in a sense an indictment of the Lebanese president himself, an acclaim of a foreign president, a French president at that, that was also an indictment of the Lebanese president, a geriatric, mentally idle quisling, whose apathy could not have replicated his French counterpart's vernal energy, nor imitated Macron the foreigner's ardent sincerity. And so, not only was le tout Beirut, the entirety of Beirut, acclaiming Emmanuel Macron on August 6th, it was also welcoming back and confirming a great and old friendship, to use the phrase of Macron's forebear, Henri Gouraud, 100 years ago, as he was declaring the establishment of Greater Lebanon. He spoke of this Mediterranean Sea that saw the fleets of Phoenicia and Greece and Rome, the same sea of holy waters, is bringing you back an old friendship. And in that sense, there were Lebanese voices, desperate voices, people coming out of destruction, if you will, crying out for the reinstatement of the French mandate, asking that Lebanon be placed once more under French protection, securing its well-being with international guarantees that would remove the specter of Hezbollah's police state and bring the country back to the fold of civilized nations. Noblesse oblige, and not devoid of the Frenchman's sense of history and responsibility, Macron repeatedly smiled at the prospects of the return of the mandate. And he was repeated at numerous points during his sort of bain de foule as he was walking among the people in Beirut, and he smiled at it at every turn. That wasn't the purpose of his return, not a return to the mandate. But he also assured his Beiruti fans at the time that he would be submitting a muscular proposal for a new national contract, as he called it, to the Lebanese authorities, and that, quote, he will be returning to Beirut on September 1st to face the people's reckoning, end quote. Now, this promise and the symbolism of its date, returning on September 1st, even if perhaps only showboating and even if only, a public relations ploy, was not lost on those Lebanese grasping at straws, craving a French sort of deus ex machina, a god of the machine, a return of General Gouraud's geste du semeur, the gesture of the sower of seeds, the creator, if you will. That's what they read into it. Again, the cries of a desperate people. But the symbolism also of calling for the return of the French mandate triggered the ire of self-righteous, resentful, post-colonialist, gauche caviar leftists who went apoplectic, reading in Macron's promise a revival of French imperial hubris. A brief lesson history, if people bother with history, a nuanced attention to the political taxonomy of France's historical mission to the Levant and Lebanon in particular, might spare the clueless the strains of misplaced righteous indignation about this idea of returning on September 1st. France's presence in the East, let this be clear, had for close to a millennium, the relationship between France and Lebanon was not born in 1920. It's not a League of Nations exercise. It's not a colonial exercise. It's an old story. It's affective. It's affective. It's emotional. And this emotion had been part and parcel of a 1,000 years or more of what the French view as an obligation, a moral and spiritual mission that was never a colonial and imperial enterprise in the classic sense. I'm not saying that France is apolitical in Lebanon, but that relationship, you can speak of French colonialism in Algeria, in the Cameroon, in other places where French colonized and brutalized, but that example does not have an equivalent in Lebanon. And so a little intellectual history and historical literacy might go a long way in this regard. To begin with, the 1920-1943 so-called French mandate was not French at all, but indeed a League of Nations mandate entrusted to France. In that sense, France was answerable to the League of Nations, also to its own moral, what it felt was its moral and emotive instincts, not some base imperial projects. So France was answerable to the League of Nations, and the sophomoric post-colonialist neuroses may also be allayed by considering the difference with the distinction between the terms themselves, mandate and flat-out colonialism or colonial exercise. Look at any dictionary, online dictionary, don't go to Oxford, okay, but any run-of-the-mill online dictionary may be a good place to start getting acquainted with the meanings of those terms, with getting acquainted with their etymologies and their historical significance and how they were applied historically. Likewise, the example of Algeria that some self-righteous leftists, I'm going to read you one in particular that is striking in its superficiality. I can't find it. But anyway, this person says, this influencer on Twitter says, you idiots calling for a return to the French mandate, have you seen Algeria? 1 million people died in Algeria, and still the French colonials would not leave until 8 years later. So French colonialism is not eating croissant, you idiots, or eating côte du bœuf, or whatever it is. Learn the difference between colonialism and mandate before shooting your mouth. Learn the history of Algeria and the history of Lebanon and the history of French relations with both places. So the example of Algeria does not obtain in the case of Lebanon. Lebanon was never a French colony. Algeria was a French département, was considered part of France. Lebanon was never, even though some Lebanese begged for it to become one, Émile Eddé among them, but that was not the case. France had no colonial policy vis-à-vis Lebanon. Indeed, I argue that France had no policy whatsoever vis-à-vis Lebanon. So its relationship with Lebanon was emotive, not political. Dig up history, read in the archives of the French Foreign Affairs, the archives of the French Army, Archives de l'Armée, you can read in the Foreign Office. All of these archival documents confirm that reality. So please stop these. I mean, I understand parallels, and I understand making comparisons. Making comparisons helps us understand the world about us, but not all comparisons and not all parallels are accurate. Most of them are actually misleading. So please stop these silly comparisons for the sake of intellectual decency. And a brief sort of tour d'horizon of this history for close to a millennium, I would say dating back to the Crusades, but at least since the early days of the adept diplomacy of François Ier and the capitulations, the imtiyazat that the French obtained on behalf of Near Eastern Catholics, and long into the modern era of the Mandate, from Gouraud's times to de Gaulle's to the present, France's approach to Lebanon had been consistently more emotive than pragmatic, more affective than effective. Unlike the British, who had a precise policy and therefore an elaborate colonial project in the East, driven in the main by the British Empire's crown jewel, India, France's connections to the Levant were primarily sentimental, spiritual, moral, driven by centuries-old emotional attachment. And so Lebanon, part and parcel of France's own spiritual foundations as the elder daughter of the Catholic Church. Lebanon was not Algeria, again, a plain French département. In contrast to the British, the French did not have a coherent policy in Lebanon. The British had a coherent Arab nationalist objective and a well-delineated policy to put that objective in place. What they wanted was a single Arab kingdom forming a land bridge area from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, to the Indian subcontinent. And indeed, the only way the British were able to bring their objectives to fruition, privileging Arab nationalism at the expense of more authentic, more legitimate, more coherent local identities, the only way for them to have succeeded was to quash French influence, to extinguish France's emotional attachment and commitment to local identities in the Eastern Mediterranean. Mark Sykes himself, of the Sykes-Picot fame, said it best, bragging that the British shall succeed sowing animosity between the Levantines, between the Syrians, meaning the inhabitants of the states of the Levant that the French inherited from the Ottoman Empire. So the British shall succeed in sowing animosity between the Syrians and the French, and the Brits have indeed succeeded, but not yet in the case of Lebanon. Macron's August 6 promise to Beirutis, vowing to return to check in on them on the 100th anniversary of September 1st, 1920, might indeed have been a diplomatic sleight of hand, kind of, political showboating. But to many Lebanese and Frenchmen, France is still attached to Lebanon by links of more than just political expediency. In July 1941, as the Free French were dislodging Vichy in the Levant, eventually ceding France's mandatory authority to rising British influence, General Charles de Gaulle reminded Free Frenchmen and Lebanese alike of France's millennial indefatigable commitment to Lebanon. Echoing the words of Henri Gouraud 2 decades before de Gaulle noted that, quote, "In the heart of every Frenchman worthy of the name, the mere mention of the word Lebanon aroused a particular kind of emotion." Likewise, he added, "The Lebanese have been the only non-French people whose hearts have never ceased throbbing to the rhythm of France's own heartbeats." End quote. France has never abandoned Lebanon in the Lebanese imagination, and the Lebanese themselves, as expressed by French diplomat and academicien in 1919, Gabriel Anto, he wrote, "God willing, France shall never abandon Lebanon." So France has never abandoned Lebanon and the Lebanese, and God willing, France shall never abandon them. Macron echoed those sentiments precisely as during his bain de foule, as he was mobbed by desperate Beirutis seeking a glimpse of him as he was walking among them in Beirut. He said, and I quote, "France will never abandon the Lebanese. Never forget," he said, There will always be a European people, a French people, whose heart will always beat to the pulse of Beirut's heart, end quote. Now, again, this could be, a diplomatic ploy. I don't care. But it reveals a profound reading of history. And history is important here. History is important to the Lebanese. History is important to the French. It may not be important here in America. We have a idiomatic expression, this is history or your history. It means your yesterday's news, forget about it. Put it in the trash. But when you say this is history, where I come from, or some of you who are watching come from, history means, I've been there for thousands of years. It means something. Now, whatever Macron may make of this old love affair, this long-standing, what I called emotional attachment, and whether his promise to return does materialize or bear fruit, Lebanon remains a nation under siege today, a crumbling republic, a giant holding cell for demoralized people under occupation. Lebanon is want of a new social order, a new political contract, a new international regime guaranteeing its safety, its neutrality, its democracy, and the protection of its people. More importantly, Lebanon is want of liberation from the totalitarian theocracy, crushing its will to live up to its vocation as the erstwhile Switzerland of the Middle East, the exemplar of multicultural, liberal, and libertine cosmopolitan Mediterranean ecumenism. Lebanon today is in dire need of a famed, maimed old man coming to make it whole again. I began with a quote from Charles Gorham. I will end with a quote from Charles Gorham. Think of the images of Venus of Milo, Nike of Samothrace, and General Gouraud. All three figures maimed, all three figures divine exemplars of beauty and completeness and wholeness. So Lebanon today is in dire need of a famed, maimed old man coming to make it whole again. A grandiose needs of somebody, even without arms, making this grandiose, graceful gesture of creation, extricated from deformation. And in Charles Gorham's conclusion, somebody who would be a Venus of Milo, a Nike of Samothrace, a General Gouraud. Thanks for listening. I thought this was going to be a 5-minute presentation. It's my first attempt at taping my thoughts, recording my thoughts. It took 33 minutes. Thanks if you stayed this long.